The winter of 1827 came to Ohio like a coffin lid closing over the living. In the settlement of Elm Creek, where the Scioto River bent like a broken spine through the wilderness, the cold brought more than frost and snow. It brought hunger that gnawed through families like rats through grain sacks. It brought madness that crept into minds starved of hope and warmth. And it brought truth to the lies men told themselves about civilization, about justice, about what it meant to be free in this new American republic. Martha Holloway stood at the single window of her cabin, her breath fogging the crude glass, watching ravens circle the skeletal trees that surrounded her property. The birds moved in lazy spirals against a sky the color of old bruises, their calls echoing through the frozen air like the laughter of demons. Behind her, on straw mattresses that had long since lost any softness, her children lay fevered and still. Samuel, 8 years old, his ribs pressing against skin so thin it seemed translucent in the weak winter light. Grace, barely 5, her small body curled into itself, whimpering in a voice that had grown too weak to properly cry. 3 months since the bankmen came with their leather satchels and official papers, their faces as cold as the February air. 3 months since they took her husband Thomas away in iron chains, his wrists bleeding from the manacles, his eyes holding hers even as they dragged him toward the county jail. 3 months since they seized the land deed that 3 generations of Holloways had worked to secure, leaving Martha with nothing but this rotting cabin on the edge of the wilderness and the slow, grinding certainty that her children would die here. The ravens knew, they always knew when death was circling. Martha had been watching them gather for weeks now, their numbers growing as Samuel and Grace grew weaker. Sometimes she thought she could understand their language, the way they cawed and clicked to each other. Sometimes she imagined they were discussing which of her children would die first, which eyes they would feast on when the cold finally finished its work. Martha's hands, pressed against the window frame, bore little resemblance to the hands that had once created needlework so fine the township women spoke of it with envy. Those had been soft hands, capable hands, hands that could make beauty from thread and cloth. Now they were cracked and bleeding, the nails broken from digging in frozen earth for roots that were not there, from tearing bark from trees to boil into a paste that might, if you were desperate enough and delusional enough, pass for food. She had tried everything. God, how she had tried. In the first week after Thomas was taken, before true winter settled in, she had walked from door to door in Elm Creek, begging for work, for charity, for anything that might keep her children alive. The responses varied in their cruelty. Some slammed doors in her face without a word. Some offered prayers, as if God would accept empty words as payment for empty stomachs. The worst were those who lectured her, who explained with sad, patient voices that Thomas had made his choices, that debt was a moral failing, that she should have been more careful, more frugal, more something. Elizabeth Winters, the banker's wife, had been particularly enlightening. Martha remembered standing on the woman's pristine porch, her dress already beginning to hang loose from missed meals, her children shivering behind her. Elizabeth had looked down at them from her comfortable height, wrapped in fur that cost more than the Holloways had earned in a year, and said, "You must understand, Martha, that society has rules. Your husband gambled away money he did not have. He signed papers he could not honor. We cannot simply forgive such behavior, or everyone would do it. You must accept your portion of responsibility in this." Martha had wanted to ask what responsibility a woman had for debts she did not know about. For gambling she had tried to stop, for papers her husband forged her signature on. But women had no legal standing in such matters. The debts were Thomas's, but the consequences were hers. That was the law. That was civilization. She had walked the 12 miles to the county seat, through snow that came up to her thighs, leaving Samuel and Grace alone in the cabin with instructions not to burn too much wood, to save their strength, to wait for her return. The county officials had been polite, at least, polite as they explained that she could not appeal the land seizure, polite as they detailed that Thomas's debts, now her debts, totaled more than the land was worth. Polite as they informed her that she should be grateful the First National Bank of Elm Creek had shown such mercy in allowing her to remain in the cabin through winter, even though technically they owned it now, owned everything. "Be grateful," one clerk had said, his spectacles reflecting lamplight as he shuffled papers bearing seals and signatures. "Mr. Finch could have turned you out immediately. He's being quite charitable, really." Charitable. Martha had tasted that word like poison on her tongue during the 12-mile walk back through the snow. She had tasted it as she returned to find Samuel unconscious from hunger, his body trying to preserve itself by shutting down. She tasted it now as she watched the ravens circle, waiting. Samuel coughed behind her, a wet, rattling sound that made her stomach clench with a fear that had become so constant it was almost comfortable. She turned from the window and crossed the cabin in 3 steps. That was all the space there was, all the space the bank had graciously allowed her to occupy. Samuel's eyes, once bright with mischief and questions and life, had sunken so deep into his skull that they looked like they belonged to an old man. His lips, cracked and bleeding, moved soundlessly. He was trying to say something. "Mama," improbably, or "hungry." The 2 words he had left. Grace lay beside him, her breathing so shallow, Martha had to lean close to confirm she was still alive. The little girl's hands clutched at nothing, her fingers curling and uncurling in some dream of food, of warmth, of a world that had not decided she was disposable. Martha had sold everything of value to buy them another week of life. Her wedding ring, the gold band Thomas had saved 3 months' wages to buy, gone to purchase flour that lasted 6 days. Thomas's tools, his father's tools, his grandfather's tools, the legacy of 3 generations of carpentry, gone for cornmeal that was mostly weevils. The family Bible, with births and deaths recorded back to 1754, gone for salt pork that she rationed out by the spoonful while her children wept. When the money ran out, she had turned to the land itself. Tree bark, boiled until it was soft enough to chew, which it never really was. Leather from Thomas's boots, the good ones he saved for church, cut into strips and boiled for hours until it broke down into something approximating sustenance. Roots dug from frozen ground, most of them poisonous, some of them merely useless. And through it all, the knowledge that they were dying, that she was watching her children die by inches, that every breath they took was 1 breath closer to the last. The ravens cawed outside, insistent, demanding. Martha stood and walked to the door, her hand resting on the rough wood. She knew what she had to do. The knowledge had been growing in her mind for days now, like a tumor, like a pregnancy, like something inevitable and terrible that she could not stop and did not want to stop. She stepped into the February cold, and the wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. The nearest neighbor, Ezekiel Morrison, lived half a mile through the woods. Half a mile that felt like half the world when you were starving, when your feet had no proper shoes, when every step through snow that came to your knees cost you more than you could afford to spend. Morrison was a successful man by Elm Creek standards. Successful meaning he had not gambled away his property. Successful meaning the bank smiled on him. Successful meaning he could watch his neighbors starve and call it God's will. Martha had gone to him twice before, once in December, when she still had some pride left, when she asked, not begged, not yet, if he might have work she could do for food. He had looked at her with eyes like chips of flint and said, "Your husband made his bed, Mrs. Holloway. You lie in it." The second time was January, when pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had begged then, actually begged, on her knees in his barn, while he forked hay for cattle that ate better than her children. "Please," she had said, the word tasting like blood in her mouth. "Please, Just a little cornmeal, just enough to get us through the week. I'll work it off in the spring, I'll do anything." Morrison had leaned on his pitchfork and studied her like she was a specimen, something not quite human. "You know what your problem is, woman. You think the world owes you something. Thomas gambled because he thought he could get rich without working for it. Now you think you can eat without paying for it. That's not how things work. Suffering builds character. The Bible says so. Maybe if you and yours suffer enough, you'll learn what Thomas never did. Character. Suffering builds character." Martha had thought about those words every day since, thought about them as she watched her children waste away, thought about them as she measured out portions too small to sustain life, but too large for her supplies to last. She thought about them now as she trudged through the snow toward Morrison's property, her mind clear and cold and certain as the winter air. She found him in his barn, just as she had 2 weeks ago, but this time he was not forking hay. He was counting sacks of corn, making marks in a ledger, calculating how much more he could get per bushel if he waited another month for the prices to rise. The sight of it, of abundance hoarded while children starved within shouting distance, did something to Martha. Something broke, or perhaps something finally snapped into place. Morrison heard her approach and looked up, his fat face registering surprise, then annoyance, then a kind of weary contempt. "Told you already, woman. I got nothing for you. You're wasting your time and mine." Martha said nothing. She bent down and picked up a rusted shovel that was leaning against the barn wall, its blade still holding traces of frozen mud. She tested its weight, found it satisfactory. Morrison's expression changed, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. "Now what do you think you're doing with that? You put that down right now, you hear me? You put that down or you'll what?" Martha's voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat and cold and perfectly calm. "Call the sheriff, report me to the bank, take away my land." She laughed, and the sound echoed in the barn like breaking glass. "You already did all that, Ezekiel. All of you. You took everything, but you forgot something important." Morrison backed up, his hand reaching for a pitchfork propped against the nearest stall. "You're mad. Your husband's gambling made you mad. I'm sorry for it, but you need to leave now. You need to—" "I'm free," Martha said, and swung the shovel. The sound of metal meeting skull was curiously hollow, like knocking on a door that no one would answer. Morrison fell backward into the hay, his hands reaching up toward his head, toward the place where his skull had caved inward, where blood was already spreading in a dark flour across the pale yellow straw. He made a sound, something between a gasp and a question, and then stopped making any sound at all. Martha stood over him, breathing hard, waiting for something to happen inside her chest. Guilt, perhaps. Horror at what she had done. Remorse. Fear. But there was nothing, just a cold, clear certainty that she had done what was necessary, that she had finally stepped beyond the rules that had kept her powerless, that she had taken from someone who had refused to give, and that she would do it again if she needed to. The laws that let her children starve had no authority over her anymore. She had been freed from them by their own cruelty. She dragged 3 sacks of corn through the snow back to her cabin. They were heavy, impossibly heavy for her starved body, but she managed. The ravens followed, their black wings beating against the grey sky like torn pieces of night. They landed on branches above her, watching, waiting, understanding perhaps that something had changed, that the woman below them had become something different, something like themselves, a scavenger, a survivor, a creature that took what it needed from the dead. Samuel and Grace ate that night. Real food, corn boiled into a mush that they devoured with their hands, too weak to wait for spoons. They ate until their shrunken stomachs cramped, and then they ate more, and Martha watched them with something like joy, knowing it would not last, knowing the corn would run out just like everything else, but savoring this moment, this small victory stolen from Morrison's corpse. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire, watching shadows dance on the cabin walls, listening to her children breathe, thinking about what she had done and what she would do next. Outside, the ravens called to each other in the darkness, their voices carrying through the frozen air like prophecy. By morning, someone would discover Morrison's body. By afternoon, there would be questions. But Martha found she did not care. The woman who had begged and pleaded and followed every rule, that woman was dead. What remained was something harder, something born from hunger and grief and the absolute clarity that comes when you have nothing left to lose. The corn lasted 9 days. 9 days of watching Samuel regain some color in his cheeks, of hearing Grace laugh for the first time in weeks, of pretending that maybe they would survive this after all. But on the 10th day, Samuel's fever returned, worse than before. The brief reprieve had not been enough to undo months of starvation. His body was too damaged, his reserves too depleted. The food had bought them time, but not salvation. Grace followed Samuel into fever 3 days later. Martha sat between them in the darkness, listening to them shiver and moan, their small bodies racked with convulsions she could not stop. She wet their lips with melted snow, whispered stories she could barely remember, held their hands and felt them burning with heat that had nothing to do with the fire that barely kept the cabin warm. Outside, the ravens had multiplied. Dozens of them now, covering the roof, perched on the fence posts, lining the bare branches of the trees. Their caws filled the air with a sound like mockery, like anticipation, like judgment. They were waiting for her children to die. She knew this with absolute certainty. They were waiting to feast. The bankmen came on a morning when ice covered everything, when the world looked like it had been dipped in glass. There were 3 of them, led by Augustus Finch, the land agent who had overseen the seizure of Martha's property with the enthusiasm of a man who believed he was doing God's work. They knocked on her door with the butts of their rifles, 3 heavy blows that shook the walls. "Mrs. Holloway!" Finch called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man who had practiced sympathy in a mirror. "We're here to conduct an inventory of the property. Bank's orders need to assess what needs to be done come spring." Martha opened the door. She had not slept in 2 days, had not eaten in 4. Her dress hung on her like a shroud. Behind her, on the mattresses, Samuel and Grace lay silent and still, too weak even to whimper. Finch's eyes swept past her into the cabin, measuring, calculating, reducing everything to numbers in a ledger. "This cabin will need to be demolished come spring," he said, consulting a paper he pulled from his coat. "Structures unsound. Banks decided to sell the land as wilderness tract. You'll need to vacate by April 1st. He looked up, meeting her eyes with an expression that might have been meant as sympathy. "There's a poorhouse in Columbus. They take women and children. It's not much, but it's better than—" "No." The word hung in the air between them. Finch blinked, momentarily confused. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Martha's voice was steady, clear as ice. "This is my home. These were my husband's lands. My children are dying in that bed. You will not take it. You will not take anything more from me." The younger man with Finch, someone with a deputy's badge pinned to his coat, stepped forward with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the law makes you invincible. "Ma'am, you need to understand, this isn't your property anymore. The bank owns it. You're trespassing on bank property. We can have you removed by force if necessary." Trespassing. Martha's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "I'm trespassing on land my husband's grandfather cleared, on land where my children were born. You come here with your papers and your badges and your rifles, and you tell me I'm trespassing in my own home?" Finch's expression hardened, his false sympathy evaporating. "Your husband made his choices, Mrs. Holloway. Debts have to be paid. That's how society functions. That's what separates us from animals. We have laws, contracts, obligations. If we simply forgave every debt because someone's circumstances changed, the entire economy would collapse. You must understand that we're not doing this to be cruel. We're doing this because it's necessary. It's justice. Justice. Martha looked at him for a long moment. At his well-fed face, his expensive coat, his confident posture, the posture of a man who had never been hungry, never been powerless, never watched his children die, while men in nice clothes explained why his suffering was necessary for the greater good. Justice, she repeated and walked to the hearth. Her hand closed around the iron poker, its weight familiar now, comfortable. She turned to face them. "Get out!" Finch took a step back, his hand moving toward the pistol at his belt. "Now, Mrs. Holloway, you don't want to do anything foolish?" Martha swung the poker with all the strength left in her starving body. It caught Finch across the jaw with a crack like breaking timber. He fell backward into the snow. Blood spraying across the white ground in a pattern like scattered rubies. The deputy reached for his pistol, his fingers fumbling at the holster, his face going pale with shock. Martha was faster. She drove the poker into his throat with a thrust that felt like something she had done 1,000 times before, like muscle memory from a life she had never lived. The third man, older and slower, turned to run. He made it perhaps 20 feet before Martha's thrown poker caught him between the shoulder blades, driving him face first into the snow. She followed, retrieving the poker, and hit him again and again and again, until her arms were too tired to lift the weapon anymore, until the snow around him was red and steaming in the cold air, until there was no doubt that he would never deliver another eviction notice to another widow. Martha stood in the silence that followed violence, breathing hard, covered in blood that was already freezing on her dress. The ravens lifted from their perches in a black cloud, circling overhead, their calls filling the air with something that sounded almost like approval. She watched the youngest man, the one she had not killed outright, trying to crawl away through the snow, leaving a trail of blood behind him like a signature. He made it to the tree line before the ravens descended on him. Martha watched as the birds covered his body, their beaks tearing, their wings beating. His screams lasted longer than she would have thought possible, echoing through the frozen woods. She stood and listened until they stopped, until there was only the sound of the ravens feeding, and then she turned and went back into her cabin. Samuel and Grace had not stirred through any of it. Martha knelt between them, the poker still in her hand, and felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart. That had broken months ago, slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but scar tissue and rage. This was something deeper, something fundamental, the last thread connecting her to the world of laws and civilization and human society. It snapped, and in its place was something new, something terrible, something free. She closed her eyes and thought about the word that Finch had used. Justice. She thought about what it meant, what it really meant, stripped of all the pretty language and legal terminology. Justice, she understood now, was just a word powerful people used to explain why they deserved everything and you deserved nothing. It was a story they told themselves so they could sleep at night while children starved beyond their gates. It was a lie, like freedom, like equality, like all the beautiful promises of this American experiment. But she had found her own justice now. She had found her own freedom, and it tasted like blood and cold, and the wings of ravens against a grey sky. Grace died the next morning. She simply stopped breathing so quietly that Martha did not realize it for several minutes. There was no final word, no last look, just a small chest that no longer rose and fell, a body that had finally given up its struggle against a world that had no place for her. Martha sat beside her for an hour, holding her small hand, feeling it grow cold. When she could finally move again, she wrapped Grace in the last blanket, thin and threadbare but all they had, and carried her into the woods. The ground was too frozen to dig, had been frozen since December, would remain frozen until March at least, so Martha laid her daughter on the snow in a small clearing surrounded by dark pines and stepped back. The ravens came within minutes. They had been waiting, after all, watching. They descended in a black cloud, covering Grace's small body with wings and beaks and hunger. Martha watched. She made herself watch, made herself see what the world had reduced her child to: food for scavengers, meat for birds, nothing more than flesh to be consumed and forgotten. "Take her eyes first," Martha whispered, her voice carrying through the cold air to the feeding ravens. "Let her see nothing of this world. Let her be spared that, at least. Let her be blind to what humanity is, what it does to the weak and helpless. Take her eyes. Make sure she never has to see." And the ravens, as if they understood, as if they were following her instructions, went for Grace's eyes first. Martha watched as they plucked them from her daughter's skull, watched as they tilted their heads back and swallowed them whole. These precious things that had looked at her with love and trust and hope, now gone, fed to birds. Because that was what the world did to children of women who could not pay their debts. Martha turned and walked back to the cabin. Samuel was still breathing, but barely. She sat beside him and waited. He lasted 2 more days, his small body fighting to the very end, his mind wandering in fever dreams, where he cried out for his father, for food, for mercy. On the 3rd morning, his breathing stopped, as quiet as his sister's, as unremarkable as a candle going out. Martha performed the same ritual. She carried Samuel into the woods, laid him beside his sister's scattered bones, and stepped back. The ravens came eagerly, recognizing her now, understanding that she fed them, that she provided. They covered Samuel's body with their black wings, and Martha watched as they took his eyes, as they consumed the last pieces of her old life, as they transformed her children into nothing but memories and bones and the contents of ravens' bellies. "Take them," she said to the birds, to the sky, to whatever God might be listening, though she doubted any were. "Take their eyes, take everything, make them blind to what this world is. Make them blind to injustice dressed up as law, to cruelty dressed up as civilization, to murder dressed up as economics. Take their eyes and spare them the sight of what humanity becomes when it builds its temples to property and profit." The ravens fed, and Martha watched, and something in her that had still been human died alongside her children in that frozen clearing. What remained was something else, something harder, something that understood that the only freedom available in this world was the freedom that came from having nothing left to lose, from being willing to do anything, from stepping beyond every law and rule and moral code that had failed to protect her when she needed protection. She returned to the cabin and sat in the darkness, thinking about what would come next. The deaths of the bankmen would be discovered soon, if they hadn't been already. There would be consequences, pauses, manhunts. Eventually, they would come for her. But before they did, Martha Holloway would make sure they understood. She would make sure every man who had profited from her misery, every man who had looked away from her suffering, every man who had told her that her children's deaths were somehow her own fault, she would make sure they paid, not in money or in land or in any legal currency, but in blood, in terror, in the same coin they had paid her. That night, she walked to town. The journey took hours through the snow, and her feet left bloody prints behind her, the last of her shoes having given up their ghost miles back. But she felt no pain. Pain was for people who had something to live for, who had futures to protect. Martha had neither. She was already dead, already beyond reach, already free in the most terrible way imaginable. Elm Creek Township slept under a blanket of snow and cold, and the false security of believing their laws protected them. Martha moved through the darkness like a ghost, like a nightmare, like a visitation from the vengeful dead. She knew where to find them, the men who had destroyed her family. She knew their houses, their habits, their weaknesses. She had lived in this town for 10 years, had baked bread for these people, had sewn dresses for their daughters, had been part of this community before that community decided she was disposable. Edmund Carlyle, president of the First National Bank of Elm Creek, lived in the largest house in town, a 2-story monument to his own importance, with white columns and a widow's walk and windows that glowed with lamplight even at midnight. Martha found a rear door left unlocked, careless, the confidence of a man who believed himself invulnerable, and let herself in. She found him in his study, surrounded by ledgers and papers and documents that represented other people's lives, reduced to numbers. He was going over accounts by candlelight, his pen scratching across paper, making marks that meant homelessness for some family, ruin for some farmer, death for some widow's children. He looked up when he heard her enter, and his expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and the beginnings of fear before settling on a kind of patronizing concern. "Mrs. Holloway, what are you doing here? How did you—" His eyes took in her appearance, the blood-stained dress, the wild hair, the iron poker in her hand. "Now let's everyone stay calm. If you need money, we can discuss a loan extension, perhaps a discuss." Martha's voice was very quiet, very calm. "You want to discuss things? Like you discussed taking my land? Like you discussed watching my children starve? Tell me, Mr. Carlyle, what was there to discuss?" Carlyle stood, his chair scraping against the floor, his hand moving toward a desk drawer where Martha knew he kept a pistol. She was faster. She had become very fast lately, as if shedding the weight of civilization had made her movements quicker, more certain. The poker caught him across the temple before he could reach the drawer, and he fell, blood pouring from the wound, his carefully maintained hair staining red. "You want to know what I learned, Mr. Carlyle?" Martha stood over him, watching him try to speak through a mouth filling with blood. "I learned that all your laws, all your rules, all your documents and deeds and contracts, they're just stories you tell yourselves. Stories to explain why you have everything and we have nothing. Stories to justify watching children die and calling it economics." She hit him again and again until he stopped moving, until the papers on his desk were spattered with red, until his body lay still in a pool spreading across the expensive carpet. Then she dragged him outside, through the snow, into the woods. The ravens were waiting, always waiting. They descended on Carlyle's corpse with enthusiasm, and Martha watched them work, watched them take his eyes. These eyes that had looked at her with such casual dismissal, that had seen her suffering and felt nothing, that had been blind to everything except profit and loss. "Feed well," she told the birds. "Feed on those who blind themselves to suffering. Feed on those who see numbers where they should see people. Feed and grow fat on the eyes of the blind." The ravens cawed in response, a sound like laughter, like agreement, like approval. And Martha returned to town because she was not finished, not even close. Judge Harrigan was next. He lived on the outskirts of town, in a modest house that belied the power he wielded, the lives he ruined with a signature, the families he destroyed with a stamp. Martha found him sleeping beside his wife, both of them warm and comfortable and safe in their bed. She stood over them in the darkness, the poker raised, and thought about mercy, thought about justice, thought about what either of those words even meant anymore. She decided they meant nothing. Words were just words. Actions were what mattered. The poker came down on Harrigan's skull with a sound like a melon splitting. His wife woke screaming, And Martha let her scream and see and understand what was happening, understand that the law her husband had enforced so righteously had no power here, in this moment, in this room. Then Martha left, dragging Harrigan's body with her, leaving a trail of blood across the floor, across the porch, across the snow. In the woods, the ravens were growing bolder. They descended on Harrigan before Martha had even finished positioning the body, eager and hungry and insatiable. She watched them take his eyes, these eyes that had read eviction orders without feeling, that had signed death warrants disguised as legal documents, that had been blind to everything except procedure and precedent. "Take them," Martha whispered. "Take the eyes that refused to see. Take the eyes that looked at suffering and saw only law. Take them and make sure he is blind forever. Make sure he sees nothing in whatever darkness awaits him." The ravens obeyed, because ravens always obey the person who feeds them, and Martha had fed them very well. She returned to town night after night, a shadow moving through shadows, a nightmare made flesh. Sheriff Booth, who had arrested Thomas, who had led him away in chains while Martha screamed for mercy, the deputy who had laughed about it later in the tavern, who had told anyone who would listen that Thomas Holloway got what was coming to him, the town council members who had voted to support the bank's actions, who had nodded sagely and talked about the importance of honoring debts, about moral hazard, about the dangers of setting precedent. One by one, Martha found them. One by one, she killed them. One by one, she dragged their bodies to the woods and fed them to the ravens, always the eyes first, always whispering her instructions to the birds, always making sure that these men who had been blind to suffering would be blind forever. The township descended into chaos. No one went out alone anymore. Men armed themselves and organized patrols, but the patrols found nothing, because Martha knew these woods better than any of them. She had hunted here with Thomas before the debts, before the bank, before the lies. She moved through the trees like smoke, like a ghost, like something that had never been entirely human and had given up pretending. The church held emergency meetings, prayer vigils, desperate attempts to invoke divine protection. Reverend Phillips stood in his pulpit and thundered about demons, about the devil walking among them, about sin and punishment and the need for righteousness. Martha attended one of these services, standing at the back of the church, her blood-stained dress hidden under a cloak, listening to him preach about evil. After the service, when the church was empty and Phillips was alone counting the collection, Martha approached him. He looked up and recognized her, and his face went pale. "Mrs. Holloway, I've been praying for you, for your soul. What you've been doing, it's evil." Martha stepped closer into the candlelight. "Tell me, Reverend, where was God when my children were starving? Where were your prayers when the bank stole my land? Where was your righteousness when men who claimed to follow Christ watched children die and called it justice?" Phillips backed away, his hands raised in supplication or defense. "You can't blame God for the actions of men. Free will is, the Lord works in mysterious. You must repent before it's too late. Repent." Martha laughed, and the sound echoed in the empty church like blasphemy. Repent for fighting back. Repent for refusing to die quietly. Repent for demanding that those who murdered my children pay for their crimes. She shook her head. "No, Reverend, I'm done repenting. I'm done begging. I'm done accepting the world you built and calling it God's will." The poker, always with her now, felt like an extension of her arm. Phillips tried to run, but he was old and fat and slow. He made it to the altar before Martha caught him, before she brought the poker down again and again, blood spattering across the white cloth, across the silver chalices. Across the Bible open to some passage about forgiveness and mercy and turning the other cheek. Dragging Phillips's body to the woods was harder. He was heavy and Martha was growing weaker, her body consuming itself for fuel, her strength coming from sources that had nothing to do with food or rest. But she managed, because she always managed, because she had to. The ravens were waiting, more of them than ever before, covering the trees like dark fruit, their calls filling the air with anticipation. "This one," Martha said as she laid Phillips's body at the base of a tree, "this one told people that suffering was God's will, that poverty was a test of faith, that we should be grateful for our trials because they made us stronger. Take his eyes first. Make sure he sees nothing. Make sure he is blind to whatever God he claimed to serve." The ravens descended, and Reverend Phillips, who had spent his life preaching about souls and salvation, became nothing more than meat for scavengers, his eyes swallowed by birds who cared nothing for prayer or righteousness, who understood only hunger and the woman who fed them. By the end of February, Elm Creek Township was paralyzed. Businesses closed. Families barricaded themselves in their homes. The bank stood empty, its doors locked, its windows dark. The courthouse was abandoned, its halls echoing with nothing but wind. And still, Martha hunted, moving through the ruins of civilization like a plague, like a judgment, like the physical manifestation of every crime they had committed against her and called necessary. But even rage has limits. Even vengeance exhausts itself. By the first week of March, Martha's body was failing. She could feel it shutting down, her heart struggling to beat, her lungs fighting for breath, her legs barely able to support her weight. She had not eaten in weeks, had not slept for longer, had become little more than a ghost animated by will alone. But there was one more thing she needed to do, one final message to deliver, one last truth to speak before this body gave out entirely and whatever Martha Holloway had become finally dissipated into the cold Ohio air. On March 28th, she walked into town in broad daylight for the first time since this had all begun. She walked down Main Street at noon, the poker in her hand. Her dress so stiffened with blood it crackled when she moved. The few people brave enough to be outdoors fled at her approach, screaming, slamming doors, barricading windows. Martha walked through the center of it all, unhurried, purposeful, heading for the town square where a gallows had been built in anticipation of catching her, of trying her, of hanging her for her crimes. She stood at the base of those gallows in the center of the square, and raised her voice so it would carry through the empty streets, through the barricaded doors, through the drawn curtains behind which people cowered and listened. "I am Martha Holloway." Her voice cracked but carried, echoing off the buildings, filling the air with sound and fury. "You know that name by now. You speak it in whispers, in prayers, in warnings to your children, but do you understand it? Do you know what it means?" She paused, catching her breath, feeling her heart stutter in her chest. "You took my husband for debts he could not pay. You took my land that 3 generations built. You watched my children starve and called it justice. You told me I was free while you put chains on everything I loved, while you crushed me under your laws and your rules and your civilized cruelty." A shot rang out from a window across the square. The bullet missed, whistling past Martha's ear. She did not flinch. She barely noticed. "So I showed you what freedom truly means." She was shouting now, her voice raw, her throat bleeding from the effort. "It means I owe you nothing. Not obedience, not respect, not my life. It means when you strip away everything, when you take and take and take until there's nothing left, what remains is the pure human will to resist, to fight back, to say, 'No, I will not die quietly for your comfort.'" More shots, more gunfire. Martha felt impacts, felt fire bloom in her shoulder, in her side, felt blood, her own this time, soaking into dress already stiff with others' blood. Her legs buckled, but she forced them straight, forced herself to remain standing, forced herself to finish what she had started. "When you sleep tonight," she gasped, blood bubbling at her lips, "if you sleep, remember my name, remember that you created me. Remember that every law you passed to protect your property, every rule you made to keep yourself safe, Every justification you gave for watching children starve, you planted the seeds of this. You made me. You did this. A final shot caught her in the chest, and Martha felt her knees give way, felt herself falling, though it seemed to take forever, falling through cold air, falling through the ruins of a life, falling through every choice and every moment that had led her here. She hit the ground, and the impact should have hurt, but didn't. She could feel her blood soaking into the frozen dirt, feel her heart trying to beat and failing, feel the cold creeping in from her extremities. But before the darkness took her, she saw them, the ravens. They descended in a black cloud, covering the square, covering her body, covering the gallows and the buildings and the sky itself. They came in numbers beyond counting, their wings blocking out the sun, their cores filling the air with a sound like thunder, like judgment, like the screaming of the damned. And Martha smiled because she understood now. The ravens were her legacy. The ravens were her message. The ravens were proof that she had existed, that she had mattered, that she had left a mark on this world that no amount of forgetting could erase. The men approached her body cautiously, rifles raised, eyes wide with something between fear and confusion. They saw her face, saw that her eyes were already gone, plucked clean by the birds even before she had finished dying. They saw the smile frozen on her lips. They saw the blood covering the square, covering her body, covering their carefully maintained illusion of civilization and order and justice. They burned her body that same day, not waiting for a trial or a burial or any of the niceties that civilization supposedly demanded. They burned her in the town square, built a pyre and threw her corpse on it, and watched the flames consume her, as if fire could erase what she had done, what she had shown them, what she had proven about the nature of their society and their laws and their freedom. But the smoke rose into the sky, and the ravens circled it, their black wings dark against the grey clouds, and everyone who watched knew that something had changed, that some fundamental truth had been exposed, that they could never again pretend that their laws protected the weak, or that their justice was anything but the strong crushing the powerless under legal pretense. The township of Elm Creek never recovered from that winter. The bank reopened briefly in the spring, but no one wanted to do business there. No one wanted to sign documents or take out loans or participate in the system that had created Martha Holloway. By summer, it closed permanently, its president's position empty, its ledgers unbalanced, its authority shattered. The courthouse remained abandoned, its halls empty, its judgments undelivered. Who would trust the law after what had happened? Who would accept the authority of men who had let children starve and called it economic necessity? Who would believe in justice dispensed by those who had been so blind to injustice that a widow had to feed their eyes to ravens before they could see? Families moved away, unable to bear the memory of that winter, unable to sleep without hearing Martha's voice echoing in the square, unable to look at the woods without seeing ravens. Within 2 years, Elm Creek was more empty than inhabited. Within 5, it was a ghost town, abandoned to the wilderness, to the elements, to the same forces that had reclaimed Martha Holloway's cabin, her land, her life. The stories persisted, though. They spread beyond Elm Creek, beyond Ohio, carried by those who fled and those who heard and those who understood what Martha Holloway represented. The stories changed with each telling, became embellished, became supernatural, because people needed to believe that Martha had been something other than human, that her rage had been demonic, that her violence had been the work of dark forces rather than simple human response to systematic cruelty. They needed to believe this because the alternative was too terrible. The alternative was that Martha Holloway had been exactly what she claimed to be, a woman pushed beyond endurance by a system designed to break people like her, a mother who watched her children die while those in power explained why their deaths were necessary and lawful, A human being who discovered that the only freedom available to the powerless was the freedom to resist, even if resistance meant damnation. The ravens, though. The ravens remained honest. They gathered in the ruins of Elm Creek for generations, more than in any other place in Ohio, as if remembering the woman who had fed them so well, who had understood them better than she understood the humans who had shared her world. They nested in the abandoned buildings, perched on the empty gallows, circled the spot where Martha's body had burned, and their cries echoed through the ghost town like memory, like warning, like truth that no amount of forgetting could silence. And on certain winter nights, when the wind blew cold and hard through the skeletal trees, travelers avoiding Elm Creek swore they could hear a woman's voice carried on that wind, still shouting her defiance, still demanding recognition, still insisting that those who called her a monster remember that they had made her, that they had created her through their laws and their economics and their righteous justification of suffering. "You did this," the wind seemed to whisper. "Remember. Remember, remember." The story of Martha Holloway became a cautionary tale, but not in the way authorities intended. They wanted her to be a warning against rebellion, against refusing to accept injustice, against challenging the established order. But for those who heard the story and truly understood it, Martha was something else entirely. She was proof that systems built on crushing the powerless would eventually create their own nemesis, that laws designed to protect property over people would inevitably spawn those who recognized no law at all, that a society that valued money over human life should not be surprised when some of those lives struck back with all the fury of the damned. The poor understood this. The desperate understood this. The powerless understood this. They understood that Martha's rage was not madness, but sanity, that her violence was not evil, but justice, not the justice of courts and judges and ledgers, but the raw, primal justice of a mother animal protecting her young, fighting back against predators with every tool available, refusing to go quietly into whatever grave society had prepared for her. Martha Holloway's name became a whispered legend in the back rooms and alleyways where people gathered who knew what it meant to be hungry, to be crushed, to be told that their suffering was somehow their own fault. Her story was told in careful tones, with knowing looks, with the understanding that she had done what many dreamed of doing but never dared. She had said no. She had fought back. She had made them pay. And if the price of that defiance had been her humanity, her soul, her place in whatever afterlife awaited, well, those who truly understood knew that Martha had weighed those costs and found them acceptable. Better to be damned and free than saved and chained. Better to be a monster that fought than a victim that begged. Better to feed the ravens your children's eyes than watch them die slowly, while good people explained why their deaths were necessary for the proper functioning of society. The scholars who eventually studied the Elm Creek tragedy tried to explain it in terms of economics, of mental illness, of the harsh conditions of frontier life. They wrote papers about starvation psychosis, about the breakdown of social order in isolated communities, about the unique pressures of the 1827 winter. They tried to make Martha Holloway fit into categories, to explain her in ways that made sense within their frameworks, that preserved their belief in civilization and progress and the rule of law. But the descendants of those who had lived through it, those who carried the story in their bones and blood, knew better. They knew that Martha Holloway could not be explained away, could not be reduced to diagnosis or economic theory or historical circumstance. She was something more fundamental, more terrifying, more true. She was what happened when you built a society on lies and called them freedom, when you crushed people and called it justice, when you watched children die and called it economics. She was the dark heart of the American promise, the shadow that lay beneath all those grand words about liberty and opportunity and justice for all. She was proof that those words were hollow, that the freedom they described was available only to those who already had power, that for the rest, for the Martha Holloways of the world, there was only the choice between dying quietly or dying loud, between accepting injustice or becoming a monster. And she had chosen to be loud. She had chosen to be a monster. She had chosen to show them what their civilization really was, what it did to people, what it made of those it crushed. And in doing so, she had ensured that Elm Creek, Ohio, would never forget. That the name Martha Holloway would echo through generations, that somewhere, always, the ravens would remember the woman who fed them, who understood them, who became like them, a scavenger feeding on the corpses of a dying civilization. The last recorded mention of Martha Holloway in official documents came in 1835, 8 years after her death, when the state of Ohio officially dissolved the township of Elm Creek and redistributed its abandoned lands to surrounding counties. The brief notation mentioned that the area was unsuitable for settlement due to persistent concerns about public safety and persistent superstitious fears among potential settlers. Persistent superstitious fears. That was how they chose to remember her, not as a woman driven to extremes by systematic injustice, not as a mother who watched her children die while those in power explained why their deaths were lawful and necessary, not as a human being who discovered that the only freedom available to the powerless was the freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. Just superstition, just fear, just a story to frighten children and warn against disobedience. But the ravens knew better, and those who looked closely, who listened carefully, who understood what Martha Holloway truly represented, they knew better too. They knew that her story was not about superstition, but about truth. The truth that civilization is fragile, that laws protect only those who write them, that justice is often just another word for the strong crushing the weak, and that sometimes, when pushed far enough, the weak push back. And when they do, the ravens feed well. They always do, because ravens are honest creatures. They do not pretend that death is noble, that suffering builds character, that injustice is somehow necessary for the greater good. They simply eat what is put before them, and wait for more, and remember those who feed them. Martha Holloway died on March 28, 1827. In the town square of Elm Creek, Ohio, riddled with bullets, her eyes already taken by the birds she had fed so well. But what she represented, what she revealed, what she made impossible to ignore, that lived on. In stories, in warnings, in the consciousness of everyone who heard her name and understood what it meant. "You did this," she had said with her last breath. "Remember." And they did remember, they still do. They always will, because some truths, once spoken, can never be silenced. Some prices, once extracted, can never be refunded. Some ravens, once fed, never stop gathering, never stop waiting, never stop reminding us that beneath our laws and our civilization and our grand promises of freedom, we are all just meat and hunger and the desperate struggle to survive in a world that values property over life. That was Martha Holloway's legacy. Not violence, not madness, not evil, but truth. The kind of truth that burns like acid, that cuts like broken glass, that cannot be ignored or explained away or forgotten, no matter how many years pass, or how many historians try to reduce her to a footnote about frontier hardships. She showed them what they were, what they had become, what their laws and their justice and their civilization really meant to those on the receiving end, and the sight of it, the recognition of it, was so terrible that they burned her body to ash and abandoned the entire township rather than confront what she had revealed. But the revelation remained, the knowledge remained, the truth remained, and the ravens remained, circling the ruins of Elm Creek, feeding on what had been left behind, waiting for the next Martha Holloway, the next breaking point, The next moment, when someone pushed beyond endurance finally understands that the only real freedom is the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to rage against. Remember her name. Remember what she showed us. Remember that monsters are made, not born, and that sometimes in the making of them we reveal far more about ourselves than we ever wanted to know.